Anyway, okay, so welcome to Generational Wealth. My name is Jacob Hartz, and I'm really excited to be joined here by two outstanding guests, Evan McKay and Joseph Goodman of Compass Lexecon.
Thanks for having us.
Pleasure to be here, Jacob.
Fantastic. I'm really excited for this conversation for a lot of reasons, and we're going to get into all the interesting things that you guys have been up to with economic consulting, working on a lot of high-profile litigation, some names that a lot of people have probably heard. But before we do that, as people know, I like to start with a little bit of an icebreaker. And this one is actually somewhat relevant to the work that you've been doing, because I found this one on TikTok. I didn't find it on Reels.
Okay.
I didn't find it on YouTube Shorts, but it probably exists on those platforms, and people are going to realize why I'm saying that once we get down to the meat of it. So this is the Lion Challenge, and it's a trivia game where you guys are competing not for a shot like they're doing at the pub, but for a Texas Instruments BA2 financial calculator. So
always wanted one.
Yeah.
Strong incentive to do our best here.
Exactly. You got to show the dog the rabbit here. So with that in mind, when I ask you guys a question, you'll take a piece off if you get the answer right. And once you get to the calculator, that answer wins. Okay. Are you guys ready?
Let's go.
All right. Question number one. Which philosopher is associated with the concept of the market's invisible hand?
Adam Smith.
Boom.
Got me.
Very nice. Question number two. Who played the nerd in The Breakfast Club?
Anthony Michael Hall.
Boom. Nice. Question number three. If demand remains constant, but supply increases, what happens to price?
It goes up. Or sorry, if
Goes down.
Yes.
Supply
Yes.
shifts to the right,
Yep.
and you move down the demand curve.
It's that sneaky demand curve.
Terrible job. This is what happens when you're on camera, the pressure's on. You try to guess first without thinking.
That's right. Number four. What holiday set the context to the film Die Hard?
Christmas. A
Should've had
wonderful
that one.
Christmas movie.
Yes, one of the Christmas classics. And question number five, all else being equal, if the supply of money increases in an economy, what happens to the value of money?
Value of money goes down. There's inflation.
Boom. All right. Now Joseph is playing for the calculator.
Okay, so there's one more for the calculator.
That's right. One more for you, but if Joseph wins this, he gets the calculator.
Got it.
All right. Number six, in the film American Psycho, what song did Patrick Bateman play as he murdered Paul Allen with an axe?
Fit to be squared.
Boom. Nice. Well done. All right. Now the final question. Both of you playing for the calculator.
It's good. Nice and even.
Yeah.
This could not have gone better.
It's for
by
all
the
the
way.
marbles here.
Yeah. I'm so excited I got to ask all of these questions. Final question. In theory, what might happen to the price of goods if the government were to simultaneously distribute stimulus checks and suspend student loan payments?
So that's going to increase people's income. So for normal goods, that means there's going to be an increase in demand. So you expect there to be an increase in demand, which leads to an increase in quantity and also price.
That's right.
Fantastic. Take that calculator.
Well done.
Fantastic. Well done, guys.
Evan, if you need to borrow this,
I might need to now.
you know where to find it.
Yeah, forget all of your sophisticated modeling tools. The Texas Instruments handheld calculator is the way to go.
Gets it done.
Yeah. Well, that was awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that was fun.
Fantastic. Great. So now that we've established, a little bit of basic economics in the classroom here, and also, a compendious knowledge of 1980s films, we can get to the good stuff. Okay, so before we get to your work, which is, I think, really fascinating, we'll probably spend most of our time talking about that. I do want to understand what brought you guys to where you are. And so to back up for a second, Compass Lexecon is an economic consulting firm. Maybe you can tell me a little bit more about what that means exactly.
I'll say briefly, which is we as economic consultants, we do economic analysis and expert witness work for litigation and regulatory matters. And so this could be a wide variety of litigation cases, antitrust, finance, lots of different things. And whenever there is an economic component, be that having to do with competition or markets or even just financial damages, that's something that we might be called in for. So typically, if there's a court case, there will be lawyers working the case, and they'll be the ones who reach out to us to get certain support. Because each case is different, the best way to explain it is really to talk about specific cases, which again, we'll do in a few minutes. But that's the basic idea.
Amazing. Okay. So it's a field that probably not a lot of people have heard about outside of people who are, studying economics. Joseph, I know you studied economics in college and got a PhD in economics from Northwestern. Is this something that you had heard about before? What did you really want to do when you started studying economics?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say for most econ PhDs, when you're going into the program, your focus is on academics, right? You're going in and trying to push the bounds of knowledge. For me, I was interested in that, but the whole time I did have an eye on economic consulting. I did an internship before grad school at a forensic accounting firm, and they do very similar work, including expert witness work and litigation support, but as CPAs. And so I did always have this in mind, and it was something I was always interested in. And so actually my route to economic consulting was quite linear as these things go. I studied math and economics in college. I went straight into grad school for the PhD, and then straight into Compass Lexecon, and I've been there for the last 14 years.
And what appealed to you about that? Like, why was that more interesting to you than going into academics?
A big difference between academia and private sector work is the focus, both in how the workflow is and what's rewarded. In academia, things tend to be slower paced and more individual focused. Yes, you can have co-authors, but a lot of the work you're doing, you're really doing on your own. For me, the hardest part was for academia, what's really rewarded is novelty. It's not necessarily about answering the most interesting question or answering your question as well as you can. It's more of a focus on you want to push the bounds of knowledge by, especially in economics, by showing a new technique or a new method or bring something new to the table. So you might have a new technique and you're picking a problem that allows you to exercise the technique, but it's not necessarily the best technique for the job, and you're not necessarily trying to get the best answer you can.
Got it.
Whereas in industry, faster paced, you're working on teams with other people, and you get to work on a lot of different cases. You don't need to hyper specialize in one thing, right? Every case has its own set of challenges, new industry to pay attention to, new fact-specific cases. But also, what's rewarding in economic consulting is answering questions really well. We're typically hired by one side, but we take our jobs as expert witnesses very seriously, that we need to say only things that we think are completely true, completely defensible based on economic theory and analysis, because when you're in a court of law, it tends to be adversarial. There's somebody on the other side who is paid to try to tear it down. And so we are using whatever techniques we can, we're trying to fit the best technique for a specific problem to solve that problem as accurately, and we need a fortified answer that is robust to different tweaks of the methodology and different assumptions to try to get to ground truth.
Right.
And so it's about answering questions well and getting to a firm answer regardless of the techniques used.
Got it. Yeah, I mean, as opposed to being in academia, when you're in the courtroom, you have very highly motivated sides who have a strong incentive and a strong stake in the outcome of your work, right? Both the people that you work for on your side of the case, but also the people on the other side who have a very strong incentive to prove you wrong. And so that level of scrutiny and almost kind of like the crucible of going through that process has got to be a lot more conducive to finding the correct answer than maybe a sort of laid back approach. And, where peer review is great in academia, but it can probably get pretty adversarial within the walls of, the university, but is different when the motivating factors on both sides are potentially billions of dollars.
Absolutely. There is a different level of scrutiny, and that makes the work high stakes.
Yeah.
And also interesting, and also you can be confident and proud of the product you put out there.
Absolutely. Well, that makes a lot of sense. So Evan, you on the other hand, did not come from the academic world, the PhD world. So how did you fall into this?
Right. I have a little different background than Joseph. I was a political science major and then pursued a master's degree in international studies, which is a kind of political science subfield, where I looked at mostly things related to political economy and development, and then wasn't quite sure where I wanted to go next. I really thought about going to law school, thought maybe I'd be a litigator. I also thought about going and getting a PhD in political science, but I knew I wanted to work after grad school. So I took a job at Compass Lexecon as an analyst, thinking I would maybe do it for a year and then go back to school. Well, here I am, almost 19 years later.
Wow.
Have never left. And you said it's remarkable that we both have, at this point, a decade or two into our career, but it's really pretty common, especially at our firm. We have a lot of lifers. I think once you find this profession, and especially the kind of work that we do, it's really hard to leave.
I was going to say, I want to make clear Compass Lexicon is not paying me right now, but it does sound like it's a place where people actually want to work for a long time. So it's got to be a pretty great place to work.
It is. It's a very collaborative environment. I often compare it to working in like an academic department, because you have a lot of really smart people that are working on interesting things and want to talk about them with each other. So there's a collaboration element to it. At the same time, as Joseph said, we're working on really interesting projects, and the work is consequential. The stakes are not, will I get this paper published? The stakes are, what will happen to my client? And that could mean enormous amounts of money. It could mean drastic measures in injunctive relief. And in some cases, it means whether or not people go to jail. I mean, we work on criminal matters occasionally. So all of these things really do raise the stakes, and it means the work has a level of importance and scrutiny that I find really rewarding, because you're doing something that's making a difference.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great segue, because one of the things that got me interested in talking to you guys and for you guys to come on this show is the work that you did recently on the FTC versus Meta case, which was huge and grabbed a lot of headlines, and everybody knew about it in some way, shape, or form, even if they didn't know all the minute details of the case. But what you're talking about, I think, is actually, let's lay the groundwork a little bit with some of the other cases that you guys have worked on that led you to be working on a case like Meta, and some of the other ones that were also kind of household names. So for example, what are some of the more high stakes cases that you guys have worked on before?
Sure. So earlier in my career, I had the chance to work on for multiple years litigation surrounding the Deepwater Horizon explosion and oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010. So this was, for those who weren't around at the time or don't remember, this was a enormous oil spill, the biggest in U.S. history. There was a shutdown of oil production in the aftermath, and there were many months or years of cleanup because oil reached across the Gulf of Mexico to beaches. We were hired to provide economic analysis of what we think of as damages, the impact of the oil spill on the economy, which is on its own a big ask. But what's interesting about that case is it's not like there's one industry that was affected. It was many industries. So it was really almost like 12 projects in one. We had to analyze first what happens to the oil and gas industry when there's a moratorium on drilling. What are the impacts on downstream producers? But separately, we had to look at what happened to the seafood industry, which is a vital industry in the Gulf of Mexico. Seafood production essentially shut down for a year. There were a lot of concerns about safety. So we had to analyze, well, what happened to the industry? What are the economic damages there? That's a tricky one, in part because while there's interesting, good data from the government on how much fish are caught each year, when you go further than that, like how much are labor workers making? A lot of these deckhands are undocumented or off the books. So we had to figure out, how do you get a handle on the labor implications of this? So
to be clear, industry. For the purpose of this case, you had to think about aggregate effects, what's happening to the economy as a whole, to the industry as a whole. But we were also analyzing for individual companies and even individual employees sometimes. How were they affected?
Absolutely.
So this is under the category of mass torts.
Correct.
And so it's like something really big that affects a lot of people in a lot of different ways. And the court basically has to decide, who gets what. in
Exactly.
damages,
Exactly. So you can imagine this would be a massive class action.
Yeah.
A lot of these mass tort cases do end up settling, and we work on sometimes both before and after the settlement. So BP is an example where we worked on the settlement after the Deepwater Horizon explosion, which then itself took many years to sort out because individuals and businesses could come forth, claim their losses, and we were part of the team that would review their paperwork, understand for this individual claimant, what is the right settlement amount to offer them.
Right. So this is fascinating. I mean, I remember when I was in law school studying about this in the context of mass torts, but also mediation and alternative dispute resolution, where you have a mass tort event, whether it's litigated or whether there's a settlement or whatever. For example, in the aftermath of 9/11, there was a large dollar amount that the court decided should go to the victims. And then that's almost the easy part. The hard part is figuring out who gets how much of a slice of that dollar amount. And so that's where you guys
Absolutely.
came in.
We actually worked on that case. Our president,
amazing.
Dan Fischel, testified, I think, numerous times on that matter. So we're super familiar with that. And that's the kind of stuff we do all the time is answer tricky questions like this. There isn't a single one answer. That often you have to use different disciplines, different types of methods, kind of come up with a fair resolution of complicated damages questions like that.
And you had another one recently that was in that category also, right?
Yeah, and even if all mass tort cases share some similarities of, for example, like you said, Jacob, there's maybe one settlement and you need to think about how to divide that up across the different people affected. But each case has important specifics. And so the exact methods you use will be case specific. And actually that does help segue into it.
Right. So most recently, I've been working on another mass tort, which is related to the wildfires in California last year.
Yeah.
So specifically the Altadena fire, which is known as the Eaton fire. So this was a terrible disaster. More than 5,000 homes in Altadena burned. And we've been working on helping the utility, which is Southern California Edison, to resolve claims. So in other words, typically on a big case like this, if people go to court, it might take 5 years for the litigation to be resolved. If your home burns down, it's really tough to tell someone to wait 5 years before they can recover. So what SCE, Southern California Edison, has done is actually launched a settlement program pre-litigation where claimants can go and receive offers and get paid close to immediately, depending on the nature of the harm suffered. The tricky thing is, how do you come up with what those offers are? And that's what they hired us to do. So we developed some econometric models using machine learning techniques. So it's kind of some of the most modern analytical approaches that we have using big data and large computer algorithms that take characteristics of the individual properties that were damaged and will generate a specific offer amount, essentially what was the value that was lost in the fire, that is better than the typical methods people use. Typically people use what's called a regression, which is like a kind of fancy averaging. Machine learning basically takes that and takes it to the next level because it allows it to consider dozens, if not hundreds, of different factors. And we train it on a data set of transaction prices. And then we can actually show that when you evaluate models this way, they do a substantially better job of predicting the price that you would expect for an out-of-sample home.
Incredible.
So that's being done right now. We're actually really proud that we played a part in helping resolve these ongoing issues for people in California.
That is really cool. That's, highly relevant to so many people, and I'm sure making a tremendous impact on their lives. So that's really amazing. So Joseph, I know that you guys had been working on this FTC versus Meta case recently, which is a big antitrust case, a little bit different than the mass tort cases. What was your role coming into that, and what were some of the cases that you had worked on up until then?
I've worked on a lot of cases, both generally in the antitrust sphere and also several in the finance sphere that are maybe closer to your day job. So I'm happy to talk about a couple of those. So a big case I worked on recently on the antitrust side was the Microsoft acquisition of Activision, which was a $69 billion acquisition, one of the largest ever. And the idea there is Microsoft owns Xbox, which, as everybody knows, is a game console. And Activision is a big game developer, most well known for the Call of Duty series, which is a very popular series of games. And so Microsoft wanted to buy Activision, and this was challenged by the FTC out of concern that it would harm competition in the gaming industry. Really, a key question in that case was whether Microsoft would have an incentive to take Call of Duty and make it exclusive to Xbox, thereby foreclosing all the PlayStation gamers from being able to play Call of Duty. So a key question in that case was whether Microsoft would have an incentive to foreclose. And so we analyzed the competition within the industry, incentives for foreclose, and also very importantly, the pro-competitive efficiencies of the merger. In a standard merger case, where it's a horizontal merger, a merger between two firms that are producing competing products, economic theory will tell you that if those two firms merge, it's going to lead to therefore less competition in the industry, and the merged firm is going to be larger. And therefore, automatically, that's going to increase the market power of that firm, and therefore their ability and incentive to increase price, which could harm consumers. And therefore, in a standard antitrust case, a horizontal merger, there's often a horse race between the anti-competitive effects of the increased market power, but potentially the pro-competitive efficiencies of if the two firms merge, it could lead to lower costs and other benefits to consumers. But in the case of Microsoft and Activision, this is what's known as a vertical merger. And that means it's a vertical integration. And that means it's a merger between two firms that are in different parts of the production space. So for example, an upstream firm that manufactures a component that is then used in the downstream firm's production process. With a vertical integration, it doesn't have the same automatic concerns as a horizontal merger, because yes, they're getting bigger, but it's not necessarily increasing market power in the same way. But also there's sort of a built-in efficiency, which is called the elimination of double marginalization. And the basic idea there is when the upstream and downstream firms are pricing separately, they're each trying to individually maximize their profits by marking up the price of what they produce. So the upstream firm is trying to raise prices as much as they can on the downstream firm, and the downstream firm is trying to raise prices as much as they can on the consumer. But once the upstream and downstream firms merge and they're jointly setting prices, the optimal price that they want to set on the downstream consumer is, say, automatically lower than it would be for the two firms pricing separately.
Right.
So normally vertical integration and vertical mergers don't get the same antitrust scrutiny as a horizontal merger. But this was a very high profile case because this was one where the government was challenging a vertical merger.
Got it. Very interesting, which is, as you say, more rare, because in theory, a vertical integration is probably better for the consumer than a horizontal one, in theory.
There can still be antitrust concerns, but there are also, again, these built-in benefits. So something that might be closer to what you work on, Jacob, is I probably spent the most time in my career working with LIBOR. Jacob, do you know what LIBOR is?
I'm probably one of the few people who can recite what that stands for, which is the London Interbank Overnight Rate.
Offered rate, yes.
Offered rate. Well, then I guess I'm not one of those people.
I often think it's overnight rate as well.
I got 4 out of 5. But yeah, so LIBOR is something that comes into our world every so often because it's one of the benchmark interest rates that firms base their lending rates on. And so it's one of those benchmark rates that we pay attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. It used to be one of the most important benchmarks in the world. It was trillions of dollars of loans and derivatives were priced based on reference to LIBOR. And what's interesting about LIBOR is it's not actually a market rate. Many people think it was, but it was actually just a survey. It was decided by a survey of large panel banks who every day would be asked, if you were to go out into the market and ask to borrow and accept that offer, at what rate could you borrow? And then the LIBOR administrator would take all those answers that the bank submitted each day, average them together in a particular way, and that would become LIBOR. But because it's based on a survey and not based on actual market data, there was a concern that the submitters would be manipulating their submissions to enrich themselves or their banks.
Right.
And there were two categories of concerns about how this was being manipulated. One is so-called trader-based manipulation, where if I'm a trader, maybe I have some big derivative that is coming for a reset today, and I'll call up my friend on the LIBOR submission desk and say, hey, it would really help me if you could push up LIBOR by even a basis point or two. So maybe a basis point up or a basis point down, that could make me $10,000.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What I spent a lot of my career doing was the other type of LIBOR litigation, which is so-called consistent suppression. Uh-huh. This idea that all the LIBOR panel banks throughout the financial crisis of 2007, 2008 were consistently suppressing their submissions as part of a conspiracy with the other banks. Mm-hmm. And that maybe they would want to do this so that they could show that we are a safe bank, and you know that we're safe because people are willing to loan to us at a low interest rate.
Right.
So they're not worried that we're going to default.
Right.
And I've spent over a decade working on a variety of cases related to LIBOR suppression. And essentially all of those cases are ended now. And it was very gratifying that for the big class action case in the United States, which finished last year when Judge Buchwald ruled in a complete victory for the defendants for summary judgment. And I will say we worked on defense on that case, trying to say that there's no evidence that LIBOR submissions were consistently suppressed, much less that they were suppressed as part of a conspiracy.
Yeah. Fascinating. It seems like you guys kind of make up a very compelling team.
Yeah.
And so and obviously I'm chomping at the bit to talk about FTC versus Meta. So you guys worked together on that.
We did.
So first of all, let's set the table of what was that case about? Sure. What was the government alleging, and how did you guys get brought in?
Absolutely.
I'll set the table, which is the FTC was suing Meta with the intent of breaking up Facebook and Instagram. Currently, they're jointly owned, and they wanted to break up Facebook and Instagram into separate companies. And something that's interesting about that is Facebook purchased Instagram 14 years ago, and more than a decade after. And so the FTC's goal was to sort of reverse that merger, which they approved, but 10, 15 years in the past.
Yeah.
And so it's very interesting conceptually that the FTC would be interested in breaking up a company that has been integrated for so long. Why did the FTC want to do that? Well, according to the FTC, Meta is a monopolist and an illegal monopolist. There's nothing inherently wrong with being a monopolist. If you're a firm and you're very successful and you gain huge market share by offering a great product, that's good for the consumer. That's good for competition. It might be bad for your competitors, but it's good for competition. And that's something that we and the antitrust laws want to support. Mm-hmm. But if you have a large market share and are a monopolist, there's a concern that you as a company might be taking illegal actions that are harmful to competition to reinforce that monopoly.
Yeah.
And that was the claim here, that Facebook's purchase of Instagram was anti-competitive in that it removed an important competitor. A competitor for what?
Yeah.
Well, according to the FTC, there is a unique market, not just social media, but a subset of social media that is personal social networks. You can also think of that as friends and family social media. Mm-hmm. It's not just that it's not like when you go to LinkedIn and it's more professional focused. And according to the FTC, it's not like when you go to TikTok where you're following creators that you might not know. According to the FTC, there is a core element of Facebook and Instagram, which is this friends and family sharing. When you want to communicate on social media with people that you know personally in real life and want to communicate with them as a group, and that Facebook and Instagram are two of the only places to go for that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. According to the FTC, there are only a few firms in this market: Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and some small firm called MeWe that I think nobody's ever heard of, or most people
Evan, are you on MeWe?
I am not on MeWe. We learned about it on the cases.
Yeah.
And therefore, the FTC's idea was, well, if you're not going to Facebook and Instagram, the only place you can go to get your friends and family social networking is Snapchat.
Yeah.
And therefore, Facebook has a very large market share. They have monopoly power, and they're using that monopoly power to jack up prices on consumers.
And so, like, how did you guys get involved in that case?
Sure. So we were approached to work on this pretty quickly after the litigation started, and the counsel for Meta, which is Kellogg Hanson's firm, they hired John List, who's a professor at the University of Chicago. That's one of our academic affiliates, to serve as an expert witness in the litigation to focus on market definition issues. And Joseph and I have worked with John for many years, and so we're natural members of his team. So we each wore a little bit different hats over the course of the really 5 years we worked on the case, but worked very closely with John and some other of our colleagues to kind of figure out first, what do we do? How do you answer this question? And then actually get it to the point of preparing expert reports. And then we actually went to trial. The trial was last May in DC. And Joseph and I were there for the end of the trial as well.
Nice. And so what was your role in that? They brought you in to answer what question, and how did you answer it?
So, what Joseph mentioned is the government's case hinged on the claim that Meta is a monopolist in this specific market that they call the personal social networking market, or PSN market. That's a kind of necessary condition in an antitrust case like that. You have to define the market. And what we were hired to do was to poke holes in that market definition. Now, typically as economists, when you want to define a market, what we care about is economic substitution, which is what happens when the price of a good changes. Where do people go? So in a textbook example is like breakfast cereal. If the price of Fruit Loops goes up, what do people buy instead? Is it Frosted Flakes or is it Chex? That's economic substitution. It's what happens when there's a change in price. Well, the interesting thing about this case is there is no price. Really, there's no dollar price, right? People use Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat essentially for free. Now, what happens is the company is monetized through ads, right? So really, users pay with their attention and their time and how many ads they see. So when we analyzed the case, ad load, which is how many ads are you seeing per hour, or what share of impressions are ads, ended up being as close to a proxy for price as we could find. Now, it's not the only one. There's other quality elements involved, but it's kind of the closest thing we have to price. So what we started was to think about, well, can we actually get to economic substitution that way? And unfortunately, what we learned is people are responsive to changes in ad load on these platforms, but there wasn't really rich enough data for us to take changes in ad load and then map that to substitution patterns, which is what we'd want to do. So what really was John List's idea was, well, wait a minute, why don't we actually charge a price? And we had to think about it, and it took many months to figure out how to do this. But what we realized is we could actually run a field experiment. So a field experiment is fairly novel in litigation. It's a growing trend in economics more generally. But with a field experiment, you can generate data that otherwise doesn't exist. So in our case, we want to see what are the substitution patterns when you change the price of Facebook or Instagram. And we accomplish that by fielding our own experiment, which we'll talk about in more detail.
Yeah. So, well, how did that go?
So what we ended up doing was recruiting about 6,000 people. And we had them install an app on their phone. And the app basically gave them a dashboard and told them, about the study they were in. But it also granted permission for us to see how much time they're spending on different apps. Then we took the 6,000 people, we put half in a Facebook experiment, half in an Instagram experiment, and then we randomized them. For a random 50% of people in each study, we gave them a treatment. We put them in the treatment group. The other half were in a control group. For people in the treatment group, we studied how much time they typically spent on Facebook or Instagram in a baseline period, and we gave them a financial incentive. We told them, look, Jacob, you usually spend 60 minutes a day on Facebook. Over the next 4 weeks, we're going to pay you $4 for every hour of Facebook that you reduce, that you cut. So if you went to zero, you get $4 every day for 4 weeks. But you can imagine some people consumed much higher levels or lower levels, but they all face this same kind of marginal change in the price of consuming Facebook. So now that we've given them some financial incentive, we could then study what happened. And so first, we learned that the price actually did incentivize people to change. So people ended up cutting like 65 to 70% of the amount of time they were spending on Facebook or Instagram. But then more importantly, we could see where that time went.
Right.
That's the economic substitution. That was the goal all along. And we used the device monitors, that the permissions people had allowed, to see where that time went. Now, go ahead.
And again, the government's theory is that there's a unique market, there's a standalone market for this PSN, the personal social networks. And therefore, consistent with the government's theory, you would expect that if people are substituting time to or away from Facebook, that should be coming from or towards primarily other firms that are also PSN firms.
Which they define as Instagram, Snapchat, and MeWe.
The big one, MeWe.
The big four. Yeah.
And so that was the real question, is when we did the experiment, where would the time be going from? Or where would the time be going to when they reduced their time on Facebook or Instagram?
And what did you find?
So the punchline, less than 15% of time went to the PSNs.
Yeah.
In fact, so 85% of time went somewhere else. Most notably, the two individual apps that consistently had the biggest substitution were YouTube and TikTok. So when people stopped using Facebook, they spent more time on YouTube and more time on TikTok.
Fascinating.
That's, again, outside this PSN box from the government, and it suggests that these are actually competitors of Facebook, that people are speaking with their time and with their money, and they're choosing to go to these other firms in response to the change in price. And they weren't the only firms. We also saw time going to lots of other apps across the board. So people spent more time playing mobile games on their phones. People spent more time on shopping apps, on the browser. And in fact, some people just spent less time on the phone completely.
Interesting.
So in both experiments, we saw that something like a third of time ended up kind of with the phone in the pocket. We wanted to learn more about, well, what were they doing? Were they watching TV? Were they on the phone? And so we did some surveys, and unfortunately we couldn't come up with anything definitive. But just the fact that people decided to put the phone in the pocket was interesting on its own.
Absolutely. So that's so fascinating, because what you were able to prove is that people don't view Instagram as the natural alternative to Facebook or vice versa.
Right.
It's people, the way that the government defined that marketplace was way too narrow.
It's too narrow.
And the actual marketplace is much bigger.
Yep.
And so by Facebook and Meta being combined, they actually don't control, half of the four firms in that marketplace.
Right.
They control two of the dozen or so firms that people actually use.
Yeah, and when you think about time spent, if you think about advertising revenue, if you think of different metrics of valuing the market, YouTube is enormous. YouTube is a really important constraint, and TikTok is also really, really large.
Yeah,
and had been growing for years. So again, the litigation started in 2020. TikTok was around then, but over the course of the litigation, TikTok exploded.
Absolutely.
And that's kind of another example of, if a new entrant could come in and command so much attention and so much dollars, it's another sign that this limited market isn't quite right.
Well, I think that, for a couple things. One, I think that if you were to ask any of the people involved, their teenage grandchildren or whatever, it's very easy for them to tell you that this is not the marketplace if they were to use those terms. But the other thing is that, TikTok fundamentally changed what was being shown on Facebook and Instagram in terms of Reels.
Yep.
So, the idea that Facebook and Instagram are in control of this marketplace is ridiculous when you realize that they're feeling pressure from TikTok so much that they're changing their product to basically mimic it.
Absolutely.
Because they're worried about TikTok taking their market share, which they probably are.
Absolutely. The evidence that we were able to put together from the field experiment, and also the other evidence we were able to find from data, was consistent with this story that Facebook and Instagram are not each other's only competitors,
Yeah.
that there's substitution more broadly, which therefore defeats the FTC's theory. But you don't just look at economic evidence, right? It's also important to look at documents and the way the companies are describing things. And as you said, Jacob, if you ask people who are market watchers, be that a 16-year-old girl or industry trade press, or even with people within the companies themselves, down the line, they say, we at Facebook, we at Instagram are very worried about the threat from TikTok. And that's a reason why we're introducing Reels and why we're expanding Reels.
So this is an incredible experiment. And the more that we talk about it, the more real it becomes. And I'm almost getting worked up, on your behalf, that it's so ridiculous that the government decided to go after Meta this way. But how did your experiment actually impact the case?
A hinge issue in this case was, what are the substitutes for Facebook and Instagram? What are the economic substitutes? Because that determines whether the FTC's entire theory about monopolization and the market holds any water. Mm-hmm. And through the analysis we did, and especially the field experiment, we were able to demonstrate that no, they are not each other's only substitutes. That the FTC might have had some theory about PSN and friends and family sharing and why Facebook and Instagram should be each other's main competitors, but that's just a theory. As John List likes to say, that theory that you have is a nice hypothesis, but you need to test that with data. Mm-hmm. And the field experiment that we put together, something that was special about it was a novel piece of evidence to bring to antitrust litigation. As you know, Jacob, with your law background, courts care a lot about precedents. Yeah. They don't like novel legal theories. If you want to do something novel, there's a much higher bar. And it's similar for the work that we do, that when we're presenting economic analysis, it needs to be based on firm principles of economic theory and established history of these are the types of methodologies that are used. And so it was actually quite high risk by Meta and by Kellogg Hansen and by our team to try to bring in a new type of analysis, which is field experiments. Yes, they've become mainstream within economics, but there's never been certainly a big antitrust case where anything like this has been tried. Yeah. And so we were concerned, would the judge accept the evidence that we're bringing in? In the judge's ruling, he was very influenced by all the economic analysis in his determination about substitutability and about the market. But in particular for the field experiment, maybe Evan, you remember the exact quote.
So he called it the best evidence on how users substitute for Facebook and Instagram. Was from List field experiment. And so full throttled embrace of what we did.
Unreal.
And so we like to think that what we do is very important and decides cases, but very often the judge or the jury forms their decision based on documents or maybe some testimony by people in the industry. And so what was something that was very gratifying in this case is the judge made his decision largely based on the evidence we put out there. And the fact that it was a novel approach to bring into litigation made it all the more gratifying. And it's lovely to get that kind of feedback.
Absolutely.
It's rare to have that so cleanly stated the way that Judge Boasberg did. I encourage anybody to actually read his opinion. It's actually quite approachable, even if you're not an attorney or an economist. It's really insightful and well written, and kind of goes through a little more than what we're able to do here, but talks through the economics of the case and why he found the evidence we presented to be so important and meaningful in reaching the decision. I guess we probably should have said the punchline if we didn't already, that the judge ruled in favor of Meta, and so the company's not being split up. Now the FTC has appealed that, so it's possible a couple of years from now there'll be more to the story. But as of now, it was a full victory for Meta.
Yeah. Well, it'd be a different story if it turned out that you guys lost.
I don't think we'd be here.
But that's fantastic, and we'll link to the judge's opinion in the show notes.
Great,
as they say. But that's fantastic. So, clearly, a big win for you guys as a firm, for Meta and for probably consumers as well of all of these apps. But in the vein of thinking about the future, how do you think this will set the groundwork for other work that you guys do?
We think this is a game changer in our industry. I think we already are being approached by lawyers and general counsels at companies that are interested in what we did. And I think it shows that field experiments can be an extremely valuable tool in litigation. This particular experiment was very large. It took us a long time to do this. But there are other ways to use experimental methods like this that are more approachable and can be done in litigation that isn't necessarily the 5-year bet the company Meta case,
Sure.
but in smaller circumstances. The key about experimentation is it actually allows us to say something more definitive than what we can usually say with what we call observational data. So because we have this randomization element where half of the people get this treatment, half the people get a control. Randomization is like magic. It's really powerful. It's why when people study drug trials, they use a random placebo element because it allows you to control for things that when we just get normal data, we can't control for. We had an enormous amount of data in the Meta case. We had already had a lot of information on how people change, how much time they're spending on apps, but we didn't have the kind of randomization that we needed to be able to make the causal claim that ended up being important. And that's where experimentation can solve a lot of problems. So we're thinking actively now about how do we apply this in other kinds of litigation matters.
Incredible.
And that doesn't mean that we're going to hang up our econometrics tool belt, right? As I said at the outset, in economic consulting, it's important to get the best possible answer you can to a question that will be convincing to a judge and jury. And that means using the best tool for the job. And frequently that is a standard regression analysis. Frequently that's going to be a sophisticated demand simulation, demand estimation, some complicated techniques. Sometimes that will be a simple survey. And now field experiments is another tool that we've been able to add to the tool belt that can allow us to answer certain questions better.
Amazing. Well, this has been fascinating. I've learned a lot just sitting here, and in full disclosure, we already had a conversation about this where I learned a lot, and I learned a lot more in this conversation right now. So it's been a real pleasure having you guys. Obviously, I wish you much success in expanding this part of your practice, and I hope to hear, many more great things. But Evan McKay, Joseph Goodman, just an absolute pleasure, and thank you for being here.
Pleasure's ours. Thanks for having us.